blood making contact with the envelope. Now, this is a very interesting fact if you think about it, because Ms. Clark gave the hypothesis to you in her closing argument that Mr. Goldman was taken by surprise, dropped the envelope to the ground. So her theory is not that he kept that envelope in his hand as the struggle is continuing, or that he would make the bloody imprints on the envelope with his fingers. But somebody was interested in that envelope. Somebody appears to have opened up that envelope and created a bloody smear on the one lens we have remaining. Somebody made the mirror image fold on that envelope. Somebody was looking in it for some reason who had been in a struggle and left a bloody imprint of fingers. It's interesting, isn't it? And it is consistent with, well, it is inconsistent, certainly, with the prosecution's theory of Mr. Simpson committing these crimes, and consistent with others. Now, let's discuss the imprints. And the hour is getting late, and there's a lot to cover here, but let me just briefly go through that imprint evidence on the piece of paper, on the envelope, and on the jeans. And what Dr. Lee found on the walkway. And let's just piece it through, simple step by step. You'll go back, you'll look at the imprints on the jeans. And Agent Bodziak did not say that he had any expertise in imprints on fabric. And Agent Diedrich said this was the first time he'd ever done anything like this before. But I submit to you what Dr. Lee said about the imprints on the jeans is simply this. And I think if you look at those parallel line imprints, you'll see they could be consistent with kicking from a shoe. When they're bunched up, all right, there was some imprints, Dr. Lee said, is accordion effect. It's just the bunching of the jeans, but it's three-dimensional. You bunch up the jeans, an imprint occurs on it, and that's why some of those lines are not complete or completely parallel to that 3-inch heel print in particular that we went over with Agent Bodziak. It could be consistent with that kind of an imprint, but I really think it's inconsistent with. And Agent Diedrich sort of gave it away that he'd never done this kind of analysis before, is this parallel lines from Mr. Goldman's shirt, because they were talking about a swipe, and you all saw what a swipe is. Swipe leaves that smear. You can't swipe and leave those kinds of patterns like that on the jeans. It doesn't make any sense that there's this flailing and hitting of this fabric and it's going to create those kinds of imprints. It's more consistent with flat, hard surface hitting the three-dimensional folded up area. That's the jeans. Now, with respect to the piece of paper and the envelope, we can have a debate about whether or not, based on this evidence, there are imprints before there's a lot of blood on the scene, the early imprints. There's no border, but that's not necessarily inconsistent with it not being a shoe print. Parallel line imprint, Agent Bodziak didn't look very hard for these kind of parallel line imprints. Put that aside. Put that aside. Let's go with what they said. Agent Diedrich said, well, maybe that's from Mr. Goldman's jeans. And then he conceded that the most reasonable interpretation would be that Mr. Goldman fell once on the envelope area, if that's his jean imprint, and then again, or maybe once at the same time on the piece of paper out on the walkway. Well, that's not exactly consistent with the prosecution's theory about how these murders occurred, is it? So I don't think that gives them any real help here. And as to those shoe prints on the walkway that Dr. Lee discovered on June 25th, one is definitely a shoe print, no question about it. The other one, Agent Bodziak says, consistent with footwear. Well, they haven't eliminated the police or the photographer. It's just an example of what you could do. He got to the crime scene for 20 minutes and did the best he could under those circumstances. It is illustrative. It is not really explained. But you don't even need that when you consider the full scope of the evidence that two people could have done this crime on these facts is a fair inference. A lot of evidence to support that proposition.
Scheck, would this be a good time?
Sure.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our mid-afternoon break at this time. Remember, all my admissions will be in recess for about 15 minutes. All right? Thank you. Record in the Simpson matter. All parties are again present. Deputy Trier, let's have the jurors, please. And let the record reflect we've now been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. All right, Mr. Scheck is making his summation to the jury at this time, and Mr. Scheck, you may continue.
Thank you very much. I realize these have been long days, and I really appreciate your patience and the way that you followed. I was inaccurate in a statement I made to you, and I want to correct it immediately. That had to do with the hairs found on the Rockingham glove. Detective Furman, in checking the transcript at 34923, was in fact eliminated as the donor of that Caucasian hair, and that was an accuracy on my part. And any time, I've tried very hard to key everything to areas of the transcript, and if, obviously, Ms. Clark, I'm sure will bring any inaccuracies to your attention. If there are any, try very hard to do that, and you should have the testimony reread. You shouldn't misread things like I just did. Another thing I forgot to mention about the Rockingham gloves, however, both gloves, and that is that they found a limb hair. Now, this Caucasian hair is not accounted for to anybody, but there is a limb hair that was found inside the glove. Now, if Mr. Simpson had had these gloves for 4 years, as the prosecution contends, then there should have been more limb hairs. One thing that you saw, and when you saw his hands, and that is that he has a lot of hair on this part of his fingers. And if these gloves had been worn for 4 years, you would expect to find a lot more of this limb hair inside the gloves. But you don't find that. So that's another point to consider that I left out. One quick point here on, do you remember Ms. Clark talked about a blood drop that landed on Mr. Goldman's boot, number 78, that on RFLP testing turned out to be a mixture of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. And Detective Lang had offered a theory to you that this mixture could have occurred because one knife had committed both of these acts, and there was a combination or a mixture on the knife, and the blood drop fell and hit Mr. Goldman's boot there. Now, the first point to be made about that is the photograph you were shown was Mr. Goldman's boot being lifted up at the time that his body was taken over into the walkway and the coroners were taking pictures of it. If you look back at the photographs and you see the way his shoe was configured, it would be extremely unlikely that one drop of blood could hit because the shoe is at an angle. You couldn't have a drop that would fall in exactly that place in exactly that way, or it's extremely unlikely. But the other thing about this so-called mixture, mostly Nicole Brown Simpson and less of Ronald Goldman on the RFLP probes, is Dr. Lee addressed this, if you recall, when he pointed out the bag in which the boots were taken. Do you remember that? This was the wet transfer of blood coming through the bag here. When these boots are taken off and it's dragged into an area where there's blood from both victims, and then the wet blood is put into the bag, any kind of typing that you're going to get, if there's a drop on that area from a mixture, the DNA test is suspect when you handle the evidence in this fashion in terms of getting a mixture. So that's a point for your consideration, I think. Now, what's left in this analysis is the Bronco, the Rockingham glove, some short final remarks, and you'll be hearing from Mr. Cochran. The first point I'd like to make when we talk about the bloodstain patterns in the Bronco has to do with something that Ms. Clark said, first of all, about the blood drops in the foyer in Mr. Simpson's Rockingham residence. If you recall, in her closing argument, she said, and I don't know how could she say this in terms of the record, that the blood drops that were found in the foyer. You recall there were 3 that were recovered by LAPD, and then when Dr. Lee went back there, he found another 3 smaller cast-off type drops. And she said, well, those drops couldn't be made by a cut on the side of the finger, comparatively superficial cut on the side of the finger. It would have to be made with a major cut or that fish hook type cut, because that's their theory, right? That there's this fish hook type cut on the knuckle that nobody sees. Nobody sees. No one. On the way to Chicago. But Dr. Lee testified about this at page 43022 of the transcript. Question. And he's talking about the blood drop pattern in the foyer. And so if one had a superficial cut on the side of a finger and shook it in the fashion I'm doing, and then Mr. Scheck, let the record reflect I'm shaking my hand down, does that create the cast-off pattern? Yes. And that would that be consistent with what you found here? Yes. And could the pattern that you found here be consistent with a superficial cut on the side of the finger? That's talking about all the drops. Answer was consistent with a small volume of blood. Is the pattern that you see here consistent with a major cut? No. So you have Ms. Clark's speculation, and then you have directly contradictory testimony by Dr. Lee, and there is no testimony in the record that supports her contention. It is mere speculation on her part. She is not a bloodstain expert, and I submit to you, you have to take the sworn uncontradicted testimony. Now, we know from what was said to Dr. Batten that in the course of getting things together on leaving, Mr. Simpson sustained a cut going into the Bronco, retrieving materials on his way out packing, and that it's the position of the defense that the bloodstains that you see and, well, briefly, why don't we take out that board, and I'll come back to it. This is the prosecution's bloodstain pattern in the Bronco board, if you recall it. Now, there are bloodstain patterns in the handle, instrument panel, console, of course, and then these are other items. That's the footprint area, and on top of the windowsill, okay? And the windowsill is somewhere around here. That are consistent, everybody agrees, with a cut to the left hand, somebody getting into the car, sitting down looking for something. Consistent with our theory, consistent arguably with their theory. But then when you start looking at the rest of the bloodstain patterns, you have to start asking which interpretation is reasonable. Now, the first point that has to be made, take this down for a second, is that, of course, initial deposits would be made by Mr. Simpson that evening, and then somebody else was in that Bronco. Now, we know someone else was in that Bronco, and that's been, I submit to you, demonstrated by the evidence. Let's take a look at this picture. Mr. Cochran has already reviewed with you the testimony of Mark Furman at the preliminary hearing, and you heard it on videotape where he said he found blood in the Bronco, a bit of a Freudian slip. But I submit to you one of the most significant moments has to do with the testimony of Dennis Fung and the bloodstain patterns on the doorsill of the Bronco. You recall that Detective Furman testified at the preliminary hearing at this trial that he observed 4 brush mark bloodstain patterns on the doorsill of the Bronco that he could observe when the door was closed. When Mr. Fung came in, he circled these pictures. And if you recall his testimony, the bottom circle closest to the door, that's only one stain. He said that that stain could be observed when the door was closed. But the other 3 stains that are represented by those other 2 circles could only be seen when the door was open. Could only be seen when the door was open. From their own witnesses, evidence he was in the Bronco. And it only makes sense that he would go in that Bronco. And how much credibility do you really put in that man's testimony? But here's evidence that he was in there. You know what other evidence there is? There's one of the most interesting facts, and it's hard scientific evidence that supports our position with respect to the bloodstain pattern in the Bronco: the steering wheel. You recall that the typing on the steering wheel was 1.1, 1.2, a genotype consistent with O.J. Simpson, and 4. Who is the contributor of the 4 allele? That was an issue, and much was made of it in the case, was it not? Lots of cross-examination, lots of highlighting of that 4 allele in the steering wheel. And the prosecution well knew that it was the contention of the defense that Mr. Furman and or other officers had been in the Bronco. Doesn't take much to get a blood sample, or you just take a swab, and the testimony is you run it through somebody's mouth. You can do a quick DQ alpha test. What is Mark Furman's genotype? We know that Andrea Mazzola and Dennis Fung, just like you do eliminations, their genotypes were taken, so we would know what they were. They are not consistent with the 4. None of them has the 4. They're eliminated. Why wasn't Mark Furman eliminated? Why didn't they take exemplars from the police on this? Why? But I think that a fair inference consistent with innocence, which you are under oath obliged to take, you must consider that Mr. Furman was in the Bronco. And the evidence is that a picture, around 4:30 in the evening, he is pointing at that glove at Bundy, walking through a pool of blood. Now, comes in to that Bronco, the vicinity of that Bronco, the area of 5 in the morning, right, initially, then goes out and does his circuitous little trip where he finds the glove and is alone for 15 minutes around 5:30. Now, there's very interesting testimony from Dennis Fung at page 21438 of the transcript about the ground. And he's talking here about Furman, and he's talking about Van Adder. He's talking about arriving initially at the Rockingham location. And he talks about how he was shown a red stain on the driver's door of the vehicle and a blood trail. And his question, okay, did you notice anything about the temperature at that time or the weather? Answer, it was fairly cool. What about the lawns? Did you notice anything that looked like it could have been dew on the lawns? Answer, I did notice there was some that the grass was wet. Question, all right. So Fung tells us that the grass is wet, but we know that there's no dew. We introduced into evidence under 1280 the weather, and when it was introduced, and you can take this back into the jury room, you can examine the areas that are highlighted in purple. The only thing it doesn't really make much of a difference to be tricky about is Professor McDonald explained all of this, that when you look at the time listing over here, it's standard time, so anytime you see a time, you have to add an hour. But when you look at the temperature and the dew point, you're going to see that the temperature was always many degrees above the dew point. So in other words, when you look through this, you'll see there's no dew. But the grass was wet, and you were at that location, and you noticed the sprinkler heads in the sprinkler system, and right in that area, that grass area where the Bronco was parked, there are 6 sprinkler heads. The grass, a fair inference, was watered regularly at that location. The grass was wet. That's the fact. Now, if you have, as Agent Bodziak indicated, blood that is caked on the inside of your shoe, even if loafers like Mr. Furman in the inside heel area, in your shoe, and then you walk through a wet area and then you step onto the carpet, you're going to get the same kind of pattern that was testified to for the prosecution side in terms of the fibers going into the shoes and getting out blood that would be consistent with the genotype of Nicole Brown Simpson that is found on the carpet of the Bronco. Then we have the issue of the blood stain pattern on the console. Now let me be precise because when Mr. Cochran was showing you about the 7/10 of a drop of blood, I just want to make sure that I saw some, even the prosecutors with a quizzical look. But that happened, I think you recall, at the very end of the trial. And that was a testimony of Gary Sims. You recall that he came back, he was testifying about the RFLP tests and the combining of all the stains. And I asked him a series of questions about combining all the stains. That is, the collection on June 14th from the console of 30 and 31, then the August 26 samples, 303, 304, 305. And we talked about the amount of DNA that you would get. With one drop containing 1,000 nanograms of high molecular weight DNA. And then when he looked at the amount of DNA when you combined all the samples, he said that it wasn't over 100. And question, so that is 1/10 of one drop of blood. That's what it is, 100 nanograms, 1/10 of one drop of blood. And he said, qualified it. He said, answer, well, you have to remember with a drop of blood, for example, if you were testing liquid blood, that is not the same as extracting DNA out of the stains worth of one drop of blood. So you're not quite talking apples. You are somewhat talking apples and oranges there, but in terms of the ballpark you're talking about, maybe getting 3/4 of that DNA out, so you can figure it from that. So then I asked him a question to try to make it English. All right, so what you're basically saying to us is that maybe if you're just dealing with a pristine drop of blood, you wouldn't get 1,000 nanograms, you get 750. Answer, something like that. Is that what you just said in English? Answer, yes, that's what I said. Okay, so if we were to summarize, and I mean no disrespect, so if we got about 100 nanograms of DNA and there's 750 nanograms in a drop of blood, can you give me that fraction quickly? That would be about a seventh. Answer, something like that. Okay, so in other words, make it very, very simple. Hard science. When you combine the amount of DNA and you give them all favorable inferences, Gary Sims, their own witness, says, when you look at the smears of blood on the console, it's 7/10 of a drop. And now, how could that be, you're saying? Let's say it's a drop or two. How could that be? Well, that's because, as Dr. Lee explained, that when you have a blood drop and you smear it over a non-absorbent surface, it smears. So it looks, small amount of blood can make a big smear. And of course, Mr. Goldman's contribution to that 7/10 of a drop of blood is at the most 30–40%. That's very, very, very little. And so then you have to ask yourself, does this make any sense? How could so little, even if we assume, how could so little be there? How could so little be there? Ms. Clark was trying to say, well, this is how the blood got there. We know the Rockingham glove had a lot of blood, mostly from Mr. Goldman, some from Nicole Brown Simpson, and that was somehow placed on the side of the console. So that's why we get the little amount of Goldman's DNA that's on the console. That's their theory. Well, that's consistent with Mr. Furman placing the glove in there. It's consistent with even Mr. Furman having handled the glove and getting blood on his sleeve and just searching around the area, or one of the other police officers, and just getting a small smear of it with his sleeve on the console. That's consistent with this evidence. And you know what isn't consistent with this evidence? Think about it. What are they really saying? If Mr. Simpson had committed these murders and he grabbed the glove, as they're saying, with his open left hand, all right, and placed it on the side, well, then in getting into the car, why aren't there mixtures on the window, right? On the window, on all those other drops, everything else, all those other blood stains, there's no trace of blood from either of the victims. There's no mixtures. Wouldn't there be other blood on the hands? And of course, their theory before you, this is extraordinary, is that he's wearing these clothes that we've just been through the evidence of struggle. If there's blood on pants, it's going to be on the seat. If there's blood from the struggle with Goldman, it should be there. We know there's no hair, there's no trace, there's no fibers from clothing, there's no berries. There's nothing in that Bronco that would be consistent with somebody that had committed a violent double homicide, that had been in a life and death struggle with Mr. Goldman. It doesn't make one bit of sense. If you look at the bloodstain pattern in the Bronco, you have to have a reasonable doubt about that. And haven't we shown you by credible, fair, and reasonable evidence that this Detective Furman would have gone in that car and by his own testimony and exposed lies from the prosecution's own witnesses, there's evidence he was there. Those stains on the door sill give up the lie, don't they? He was in that car, and probably more than one of them was in that car. Now, with respect to the credibility of the evidence, very briefly, and I know you followed this, we have to make a distinction. You know, in her opening statement, Ms. Clark actually said to you that all she was going to talk about in her opening statement with respect to the Bronco were the stains that were collected on June 14th. She didn't even indicate they were going to offer you anything from after August 26th because they know how terribly this was handled and that no jury could really accept the integrity of the evidence after this car was abandoned. But could we bring up the board, please, on the 13, I think it's 1351. The DNA board with the very briefly, you recall this. And we made a distinction here. We have to look at the samples that were collected on June 14th and the samples that are collected on August 26th, as Dr. Gertie suggested to you. If you look at the June 14th DNA evidence, okay, with samples 30 and 31, nothing in 30, 31, they're calling this faint 1.3 allele, where the 1.3 is showing up in the controls. And you remember the whole business about development length and the notion of controls failing. This is it. From June 14th, this is it with respect to DNA from Mr. Goldman in the Bronco. That's it. And as Dr. Gertie's indicated to you, that is not credible scientific evidence. Of course, they're offering you evidence that was collected on August 26th, after this vehicle was literally abandoned, after the no special care hold had been taken off it, after there was a theft. Now, Mr. Mraz, he wasn't the world's most credible witness on the issue of the theft, but I really think that's besides the point. Number one, he's stealing, he's inside that car. What's going on? He didn't see blood, but you don't have to accept Mraz. What about Detective Muldorfer, who's investigating this? She doesn't see blood. And then there's Mr. Blazzini. He doesn't see blood on the console. And we know that there's all kinds of people allowed into this vehicle, and probably more disturbing than anything else, as Detective Muldorfer indicated, the rules are violated, and there is no record kept of any authorized police personnel, of any police personnel going in and out of there. They could just go in and out and no records were kept and nobody would know, period. And all of a sudden, what we have on August 26th, when the car is finally brought in, and Ms. Clark said it was she must have misspoke when she tried to imply that the inspection of the Bronco was at the request of the defense. Those are not the facts. The facts are that they brought it in, they allowed the two defense people to observe, and then Michelle Kessler looks in the vehicle, and there's a photographer that was brought down from Life magazine at the behest of the police commissioner to witness this grand examination of the Bronco, and lo and behold, they find as much blood on the console on August 26th as there was on June 14th. And then when they do the DNA testing patterns, they find not only traces of Mr. Goldman's blood, but Nicole Brown Simpson's blood in those same areas. That is awfully odd. So the integrity of the evidence, again, is in question here in terms of what you can accept beyond a reasonable doubt. But even if you're willing to look aside from that, and I don't really think that one can, in fairness, I think that the defense version of how the blood got there and the bloodstain pattern in the Bronco is far more plausible than the prosecution's version. It just doesn't fit. There would be mixtures on all those stains according to their own theory. There should be more blood in the Bronco, given what occurred in this case. The bloodstain patterns don't make sense, do they? They really don't. And nor does the hair and fiber in that Bronco. Now, let's talk about the glove. The first point to be made about the glove is an integrity issue. And that is that you recall that when Mr. Yamauchi opened up the reference tube in the morning and spilled out the blood, the first thing he did after that was this examination of the Rockingham glove. And as you recall, he was putting his initials in, he was doing all these phenotesting, these manipulations, all in the wrist area of the glove and manipulating it. There is so little DNA in these few areas here from the D1S80 tested, minuscule nanogram amounts, very, very small, consistent with a small sample handling transfer from Mr. Yamauchi. And that alone, I think, can explain the small amount of DNA on the glove. But of course, under the other scenarios, the competing scenarios of the defense and the prosecution, if the Rockingham glove was up against the side of the console, that certainly would, of course, explain a small transfer of Mr. Simpson's blood into the heel area of the glove. But you know what doesn't make sense? What doesn't make sense is their theory. First of all, the tight glove is thrown off from the left hand in the course of the struggle. But they're saying that with a cut, a bleeding cut, the fish hook on the knuckle, which nobody sees on the way to Chicago, and blood on this hand, the gloves are taken off. Can they really suggest to you that gloves are taken off at the wrist? I'm from back east Brooklyn. You know, I wear a lot of gloves. You may not have as much experience. But think about it. You don't take gloves off like this. You take them off like that. And you know what? That's exactly what the criminalists were thinking. That's what Gary Sims was thinking. Even Mr. Yamauchi was thinking that. Because most of the initial DNA testing all was done looking for blood on the fingers, top fingers of the glove. Because that's all that makes sense. And there was nothing there. And that's got to give you, I would submit, a reasonable doubt. So what I've tried to do in my remarks is review with you essential pieces of circumstantial evidence of the prosecution's case. And we don't have to do that. We don't have the burden of proof in this case. And each essential piece, I think it's fair to say there's a reasonable doubt. And some of these are so profoundly disturbing in terms of the manufacturing of evidence in this case that I'm sure you really can't abide it. Not in this country, not in this democracy, can we allow dishonest, manufactured evidence to lie at the heart of a case like this. It cannot be. You cannot trust. I mean, you cannot go back and say, well, maybe they planted evidence on the glove, maybe on the back gate. Oh, there's blood missing. Big deal. How can that be a big deal? There's many, many reasonable doubts embedded in all of that. But you know, there's a fourth C. Contaminated, compromised, and corrupted. But there's a fourth C that goes along with how these things happen that relates to this forensic testimony. And the fourth C has to do with cover-up. And I'm not even talking about the statements of the police officers and the cover-up of Mr. Furman that Mr. Cochran has discussed with you so eloquently in the last 2 days. Let's just talk a little bit about the criminalists and what you can view in terms of that evidence and how that affects on their credibility, because if you lie in small things, and some of these are not so small things, you lie in big things. And if you're trying to turn the other way and cover up real problems, serious problems, you can't abide it. Now, one I alluded to early, and I just think it goes to the heart of the hair and fiber evidence in so much in this case. And your common sense tells you. They moved Mr. Goldman's body. They were traipsing around that crime scene. And we know the envelope was moved, and we know the glove was moved, and somebody put it back. And remember, Mr. Fung, they actually have a form. If the scene was altered, you know, describe how. And Mr. Fung says, it's not my job. We don't ask. Detective Lang, do you know? I don't know. Did anybody ask Jacobo or Ratcliffe, the coroners? Did anybody come in and do an investigation? Isn't it important to know who's moving around this evidence, that they're going to come in and make a big deal about hair and fiber and other things? Don't we have to know that? Isn't that just fair dealing with you? And how can, I mean, they're covering this up. They're covering up how miserably this was handled and how the integrity of the evidence was compromised. It's as plain as day. It's an insult to your intelligence to say otherwise. Why? They have a responsibility to come in here and do that. And we looked at videos where I submit to you there's a glove on the blanket that somebody put back. And then there was the testimony, you know, Detective Lang said, and if this isn't covering, I don't know what is. Well, why did you move the bodies? Why did you wait so long to bring the criminalists in? Why did you move the bodies before you collected the evidence? Because that's lunacy. And the answer was, this is what you call a closed-in crime scene. And in a closed-in crime scene where the evidence is close to the bodies, the first thing you do is move the bodies? That was a makeup. It was nonsense. As all the other criminals who came in here and testified, even Mr. Fung couldn't abide that, because it's covering for mistakes. Now, another one is just the whole way it went. Mr. Fung, when he testified in the grand jury, and initially at the preliminary hearing, he forgot Andrea Mazzola was there with him because she was a trainee and she played a big role in this case in handling the evidence, and they wanted to forget it ever happened. And, you know, that's the way it was. And, you know, when I asked him, well, was there any concern in the lab about this before you went to testify in the grand jury of the preliminary hearing? No. It's just this habit I have of saying I when I mean we. It's a habit of testifying. But, you know, when Ms. Kessler came here, she was actually asked by Mr. Neufeld, was there any discussion before Mr. Fung testified in the grand jury about what went on in this case? And they said, well, there was some concern that Ms. Mazzola was listed on the forms as the officer in charge. And I think that tells you all you need to know. Of course they were concerned about that because they realized that the whole scene had been miserably botched. And there were serious problems here with the integrity of this evidence. Then, of course, there was the handoff of the envelope, and just as a quality of testimony. I mean, Mr. Fung said, oh, I wouldn't take that envelope, pick up that envelope with my bare hands, and then we showed it to him on videotape where he's picking up the envelope with his bare hands, and then he goes, well, that couldn't have happened because the coroner, Mr. Jacobo, wasn't there, so I have the timing right, and then we showed him the videotape of Mr. Jacobo walking by that he was still there. Well, there's something wrong with the quality of testimony like that. There's something wrong when Ms. Mazzola conveniently begins to close her eyes because problems arise on how the trash bag is carrying this blood vial out sitting on the couch. There's problems with the whole trash bag story. There's problems, there's an extraordinary problem with Ms. Mazzola suddenly forgetting that her initials are on the bindles, when the only credible testimony is that they were there and something's wrong. So when something's wrong, people's memories get selective, and testimony comes in funny ways. Dr. Goldman, the coroner, never showed up. Mr. Martz destroyed his underlying digital data and didn't save much of the data. Mr. Martz stopped looking in terms of testing. Mr. Rubin stopped looking pretty early. We have an EAP exclusion on the fingernails that they're desperately trying to change. And then, of course, there's Ms. Kessler can't even remember the substance of the meetings that were had early in the case about security of the samples. And then that was remarkable. Remember when Ms. Kessler, when we were talking about looking for blood on the sock, and it said blood search not obvious? And then remember that testimony which said, well, that wasn't a blood search. Well, it says blood search right here. Well, that wasn't a blood search. I mean, some of it was remarkable. And then, of course, there's the Thanoparades tape and the missing blood. There's a lot of it. I'm sure you remember more than I've just listed. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I thank you very much for your patience. I've tried to reason through this evidence, drawing the fair inferences as best we could, looking at the integrity of the evidence, And I just think there's very little question here, is there? So much of the essential facts in this case are just shot through with reasonable doubt. There is something wrong. There's something terribly wrong about this evidence. Somebody manufactured evidence in this case. There's missing blood. There's EDTA. There's questions, serious, deeply troubling questions. You must distrust it. You have to distrust it. You cannot render a verdict in this case of beyond a reasonable doubt on this kind of evidence. Because if you do, no one's safe. No one. The Constitution means nothing. This cannot, will not, shall not happen in this country with you good people. It just won't. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Scheck. You want to take a change over here?
Just 3 minutes or so.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you to just step back into the jury room. Probably be about 5 minutes.